We're about to get into one of the most powerful concepts in finance because we're about to talk about net present value. And net present value will allow us to do a lot of valuation. Okay, so pricing of securities like stocks and bonds, understanding the value of business decisions or projects that you want to undertake. There are just so many things in finance that use this concept of net present value. And so we're going to get into this concept because it's the basis of understanding multi-period cash flow time value of money. So far, we've really looked at what are called lump sum time value of money problems, where you've got one present value and one future value cash flow. And really, if we draw this out on a timeline where we've got some cash flow out in the future and we've got an equivalent present value, and really the only things that happen are cash flow here, and a period of time that transpires in between. That's all we've really dealt with. Most financial products that we deal with as consumers, home loans, car loans, student loans, credit cards, investments in stocks and bonds, if you own rental property, like hiring someone, actually there's an arrangement where there may be multiple cash flows, right? So let's look at an installment loan or a fixed rate loan like a mortgage or a car loan or something like that. In that case, you borrow a lump of money up front, and in exchange you make a series of payments, right? On and on and on until you fulfill your obligations and you pay off that loan. So this cannot be handled all at once with just this formula because we've got multiple cash flows, not just one. The nice thing about that is this formula is the underpinnings of how we would value multiple future cash flows and find an equivalent present value. And so the underlying concept of the way net present value works is the present value of a series of future values is just the present value of the sum of those future cash flows. All right? And so this is what we would call a net present value, or a NPV, okay? The sum of the present values of future cash flows, okay? So you can think about each one of these terms represents the present value of that year's cash flow, right? And so if we take a sum of the present values of all the future cash flows, that tells us the value of all those cash flows. Because the nice thing is, if we move the value from year one back to today, and then we move the value from year two back to today, well, both of those values are in the same time period, and we can add them up. All right, time value money handles a problem for us, which is equivalent dollar values don't have the same actual value if they happen at different periods of time, right? So like, to illustrate that further, if somebody gives you $100 today, that's worth more than if someone's going to give you $100 in a year, right? It's still the same value, $100, but we don't view those as equivalent because one is a future value and one is a present value. And so the interest rate tells us how to balance values through time. But if values occur at the same point in time, we don't have to do time value of money. We can just add them together or subtract them or do whatever we want because, hey, $100 now versus $50 now, I know exactly the difference between those two things at the same point in time. And so the thing is, well, this allows us to take a bunch of cash flows and put them all into present values, and then we just add up all those present values, because once they are all in the same time period, we can just add them, subtract them, whatever we need to do. And so that's the underlying concept of a net present value. So what would we use a net present value for? Net present values can help us understand stock pricing or bond pricing, or something like how much house can I buy? Net present value is kind of also at the root of figuring out loan payments. Right? Or, the value of insurance policies, or just, all kinds of things. The value of, hiring a new employee or undertaking a new product development, right? All of these things involve somewhere in the line net present value calculations, because we have to take cash flows that occur at multiple periods in time, but since they're all related to the same thing, we need to put them together to understand value. And so it's very powerful, and it shows up all over the place. And again, the underlying concept is something is worth the present value of all the future cash flows that it generates. So if you think about, like, how much is a stock worth? Well, the share of stock is going to produce some future cash flows to the investor. If I know what the cash flows are, when they happen, and an appropriate discount rate, I can do a net present value, and that should tell me what that stock is worth. Same thing with a bond. Bond pays a bunch of future payments out. Well, if I can find the value today of each of those future payments and I add them all up, well, that's what a bond is worth. When it comes to a mortgage, how much money can I borrow? Well, you figure out what payment can I afford to make every month for 30 years, then I find the present value at current interest rates of all those payments. That tells me the sum of the values. Well, that's how much money I can borrow, i.e., that's how much house I can buy. And likewise, if we go backwards through that and I borrow a sum of money and I know how many payments I want to make to pay it off and how, those are spaced out through time, I can find my interest rate, take that lump of money, and solve for the future values, which are then going to be my loan payments. And so this formula shows up all over the place. So let's do a very simple, quick example, but this is very straightforward given what we've already kind of seen. So let's look at it. All right, so let's set up a very small example. We are going to do a very simple 2-payment loan. All right, and so let's say that you are looking at a 2-period loan where you have to make one payment at the end of 1 year of $110. You are going to make a payment at the end of year 2 of $121, and let's say that the interest rate is 10%. And the question is, how much money did you borrow? Okay, this is what we want to solve. Okay, well, we can say that the present value is going to be equal to the sum of the present values of each of these payments. And for each payment, this formula represents how we would find the equivalent present value. So for the first cash flow, well, we take the future value divided by 1 plus R raised to the t. Well, this is in year 1, so we raise that to the first power. Plus, well, here is the next cash flow. We divide by 1 plus R We raise it to the t power. Well, this is in year 2. There you go. And if we do this, we will know how much this is worth. Well, this ends up being 110 divided by 1.1 plus 121 divided by, well, this ends up being 1.21. So this ends up being equal to 100. This is equal to 100. And this is equivalent to a present value today of $200. So this is basically saying, hey, if you borrowed $200 right now and the interest rate was 10% and you wanted to pay it off over the next 2 years, you could make these payments and that would work out, okay? The present value of these 2 future cash flows is $200. Now, this could be a different way to look at it. If you invested $200 today, would you be okay receiving these 2 future cash flows in exchange for your $200 right now? Well, if you're okay getting a 10% rate of return, then yeah, this would be a good deal, because at $200 investment with these future payments, this investment would earn 10% because that's the rate I used. And so this is how NPV works. We find the present value of each future cash flow, we add them all up, and that equals our present value. And so as we move forward, what we're going to do is look at a lot of those things like bond pricing, right, or stock valuation, okay, or loans, right, annuities. All these things we're going to look at, but the thing you got to understand is we are going to be taking this approach, a net present value approach, in the valuation of all these things and more. And so we're going to show you how net present value is going to show up in all kinds of places. And again, this is one of the most powerful tools that we have in finance. It's very simple. It's at its core, something is worth, right? A financial security is worth, any economic exchange is worth right now the sum of the present value of its future cash flows. And at the end of the day, if I want to know what something is worth, I need to figure out what are the future cash flows expected to be, when are they expected to happen, and what is an appropriate discount rate. If I can figure out those 3 things, I can tell you what anything is worth today. But these things, that is the hard part. The math, not that bad. Figuring out those values, that's pretty tricky.